All right, Mark, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, well, it's been I'm here in Washington, D.C., where it's been such an incredible morning of inspiration and excitement for tomorrow's Hill Day. But taking a break in the staff room here, just ran off stage and wanted to pick the brain of someone whose brain is often focused on all things UN, and chat with Mark Goldberg. Mark is the editor of UN Dispatch and hosts the Global Dispatches podcast, which tackles some of the biggest challenges that the UN is facing, that the world is facing. And he's also among some huge devotees here. You've got a lot of listeners of your own podcast here on the in this session. So I really appreciate you joining. Welcome.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Great, great. And as we're chatting today, I just want to encourage folks to use the chat function so that, as questions come up, that you can ask the experts. All right. I wanted to get started. I've been a fan of your podcast for quite some time. And, you tackle every kind of news story that is coming out of New York and Geneva and around the world. Given there's so much happening, how do you decide on some of the stories that you focus on?
No, it's a good question. So the podcast publishes 2 episodes a week, every week, and has been doing so for the last 10 years. And every episode, if you're not familiar, is structured around an interview with an expert on some topic in global affairs. So the question is, how do I choose the topics to cover and the people to interview? There is a lot obviously going on in the world at any given moment. What I try to do is shine a spotlight on stories that other media outlets sometimes miss or don't give the attention that I think it deserves. And I'll give you like a recent example of this. Last week, I published an episode of the podcast on the review conference of the UN's Chemical Weapons Convention. This is one of the largest multilateral, most widely adopted multilateral treaties there are. I think only 4 countries have not yet ratified the Chemical Weapons Convention, which seeks to both ban the use of chemical weapons and eliminate existing stockpiles. And the way that these kind of multilateral arms control treaties work is that every 5 years or so, members of the treaty body come together to assess progress they've made and think about and debate ways that they can improve and strengthen the treaty going forward. And I thought it's probably a good idea to cover this 5-year review conference that was underway in The Hague just a few weeks ago in the middle of May. But lo and behold, I was doing some Google News searches, and there was precisely 0 English language Western media that were covering this event. There were a few articles from think tanks here and there, but no real news outlets doing this. No one gave it sort of journalistic coverage. And so that to me seemed like a prime opportunity for global dispatches to give this important issue of global concern the attention it deserves. So in general, I try to look at what stories are not being covered, but I think ought to. That said, I still do follow like the more mainstream news cycle here and again.
Some of the topics that you just referred to are really complex. They're incredibly esoteric. As you think about breaking down the story, what are some of the ways that you approach storytelling to make it digestible, but also recognize that there are these long histories that and complexities that go into the issues you're tackling?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. In preparing for each of my interviews, which usually last about 30 minutes, in my head ahead of time, I try to think of what would be a narrative arc, a narrative journey that I could take the listener on as we're telling what are sometimes just policy stories, right? I don't do like human interest stuff typically. So it's often harder to create stories around policies and also stories around solutions to global problems. And a lot of what I do is called solutions journalism, in which we shine a spotlight not just on the problem, but how to fix the problem. So ahead of every interview, I sort of think to myself, what would be a narrative arc, a story that I could tell about this policy or about this problem, about what the solutions to this problem might be, that are both like entertaining. I mean, this is like a form of entertainment in a way, but also accessible to an audience. Now, I should note that the audience that listens to the show is not like a general interest audience. It's people who have some prior interest or prior engagement in international issues and foreign policy. People like who are members of UNA USA certainly are the target audience of the podcast. And so are people who work in the halls of government and think tanks and in other media, people who work at the UN. How can I help them do their job in a more meaningful and more informed way through conducting this interview is usually kind of the attitude I take going into every episode.
What's some of the more interesting content, stickier stories that you've done in recent past?
Ooh, like stickier stories. So it's so hard. I do 2 episodes a week every week, and I've been doing this for such a long time, for over 10 years now. That there certainly are a lot of sort of recurring themes. One sort of, I do like to often have a focus on global health issues. So just today, I published an episode about the progress against tuberculosis. I interviewed the head of the UN-backed Stop TB partnership. Earlier, a few weeks ago, I did an episode on cholera epidemics around the world, which is surging. So I do like to sort of frequently revisit issues related to global health, and this includes pandemic preparedness. In November 2019, I published an episode titled "Are We Prepared for the Next Big Pandemic?" And sure enough, a lot of the lessons embedded in that interview are ones that we saw play out over the subsequent 3 years. So there's just like many recurring themes. Another one that I foresee that has been sort of more pronounced, at least since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, has been geopolitics and geopolitical dynamics, not just how they're impacting debates at the Security Council, but more broadly, how we're seeing like a shift in like world affairs. And this is being manifested in many regions in many ways. More recently, you can see this shift underway in the Middle East with Iran and Saudi Arabia kind of coming a little closer together. And Assad, who the Saudi Arabian government used to seek his ouster, is now being brought back into the fold of the Arab League. And these are all just kind of riveting geopolitical shifts that are taking place that are, I think, accelerating and have accelerated since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's sort of unrelenting rise as a global power.
Why do you think it is for Americans now, to your point, getting engaged in conversations around geopolitics? It does feel like there's so much more interest, whether that looks like being involved in conversations around Ukraine or Russia. But beyond that, it seems like there's much more of an interest in sort of the global scene among Americans. What do you think that's attributable to?
You know, I think it is a consequence of, I think, accessibility in terms of, when I started doing the podcast 10 years ago, and I started like blogging, 13, 15 years ago, there was just a narrowness in media outlets that were serving good global content to people. There wasn't that much to begin with, but you really just had, in previous eras, just like a few handful of mainstream outlets that could get you reliable information about the world, like New York Times, CNN, that sort of thing. But, the advent of social media and the maturation of web-based publications and podcasts has enabled audiences, I think, to kind of find their niche more easily. And so you have like tons of people out there who are interested in like UN issues and global affairs issues more broadly, who previously wouldn't have very many sort of outlets or ways to access that information. Now there's a lot of it out there. Not only what I do, I'm certainly part of the mix, but other social media handles or other publications as well that just give people the opportunity to get exposed to news beyond like their kind of four corners. And I think that's had a big impact in this kind of global awakening that we've seen among Americans in general.
That also double-edged sword, right? With the proliferation of so much media and so much news, you mentioned social media. That's got to make it difficult for someone like you as you're researching topics or you're kind of trying to cut through the clutter to discern sometimes what the story is, fact and fiction, since it's often hard to do so in a social media space.
Yeah, no, like I think that's true for like people who don't do this professionally like I do, but I have like a pretty good radar. I've been doing this for so long that I can kind of tell what's BS and what's true.
Yeah.
What's fact, what's fiction, what's disinformation, what's misinformation, what's reliable. Just because I have like my sources. I've been doing this for like a long enough time that it's kind of easy for me to discern what like the real facts are, what the real story is. But I agree that if you're like more of an amateur, or if you're just someone who's casually interested in international affairs, or maybe even passionately interested in international affairs, but don't spend like 24/7 in front of it like I do, that it can be very difficult to find reliable information, or better, even more so, have like a heuristic to understand what is true, what is not true, and what sources are reliable and what's not.
Yeah, even at the UN Foundation, one of the things that we've been following a lot recently is the conversations, negotiations happening at the World Health Organization with pandemic preparedness. And it's been quite fascinating to just see all of the information out there, disinformation as well. And we've seen the proliferation of disinformation in the context of peacekeeping. And how that's increased threats against peacekeeping missions around the world. So what you're doing is so critical in terms of providing that voice. Knowing that you do have such a broad footprint with your work, are there any stories that you haven't covered that you've wanted to tackle?
I've really wanted to interview Jimmy Carter, but sadly, I don't think that could happen. He's sort of my one person that I've always wanted to interview, just for the fact of his post-presidential career in identifying guinea worm as a disease of all the diseases in the world to tackle, chose that. And, here we are, a few years later, and just last year, there's something like 5 guinea worm total cases around the world, and just tantalizingly close to global eradication. That's an individual I would have loved to interview. Stories more broadly. I mean, to be honest, I mean, I like don't have a boss. Like I can kind of decide my own stories. So if there's a story I'm passionate about, chances are I've pursued it, and you could find it in like the 900 plus episode archive of the podcast.
That's great. So what are some favorite guests? Since you mentioned Jimmy Carter, what are some other favorite guests that you've had on the show?
So, on the show, I've interviewed, presidents, prime ministers, like Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General. I've had like a lot of like very famous people on the guest, but to be honest, of like all the quote unquote very famous people, none of them have been more memorable than the people you might not have ever heard of, who are just very passionate about the issue that I'm interviewing them on, or have just a really interesting personal story to tell. I can give you one example from the last year and a half. There's this woman, her name is Zura Bahman. She's Afghani. She lives in Kabul. I've had her on the podcast a couple of times now. She happened to have been out of the country on a business trip, I think in like Turkmenistan or something like that, when Kabul fell to the Taliban, in August of 2021. And so she just like was on a business trip, like all her stuff, she didn't expect it. It took her by surprise, like it took a lot of people by surprise. But when I interviewed her, she was determined to get back to Kabul as quickly and as possible, as soon as she can get some assurances about her personal safety. She just wanted to get back to Kabul and continue running her NGO, which is a local peace building NGO. It's a branch of the larger NGO called Search for Common Ground. And just like that, her revealing her mentality of, it is my country. These are like now the de facto rulers. We need to think of a way to work with them to pursue our discrete and concrete objectives around like peace building and women's empowerment to the extent we can in the context of this new reality we're all living in. And I've had her on the show a couple of times just to kind of give updates of how that work is going in the midst of, Taliban rule in Afghanistan. I just find like her story compelling and her perspective one that you don't often see ever, like in media. Just like a woman who is running an NGO who is willing to make compromises to work with the Taliban, who herself is being like persecuted by the Taliban, but just like understands that there's like a modus vivendi we need in order to work with the de facto rulers of the country. So I find that really interesting. There have been other guests as well. And again, typically the best episodes are not like the most famous people, but people who are just really good at being interviewed.
That's great. That's great. I've been scrolling through and looking at some of the questions because we got quite a few questions. So I'm going to hit you with some of those. But I want to start actually with Mark. Mark wrote in and said, I'm 12 years old and of Ukrainian origin, born in Canada. My question is this: does the UN help to stop Russian aggression? So I'd love to hear your response to that, particularly and with some of the interviews you've had recently on the Russian invasion.
This is a great question, and it's something. I think the answer I am about to give is something that the other members of other folks on the call can also use if they're asked the same question, because I do get this question a lot, and it's a really good question, Mark. I got it like 2 days ago on C-SPAN. I was doing one of these like C-SPAN call-in shows, and a listener called in and said, a version of Mark's question, what good is the UN for if it can't stop Russia's aggression in Ukraine? And so here's the answer that I gave, and the answer that I give often when I am asked this question. So it is true that the Security Council has been unable to stop Russia's invasion of Ukraine for the fact that Russia has a veto on the Security Council. The Security Council as an entity has been impotent in the face of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, there have been other parts of the UN system that have risen to the occasion and are acting in ways that we would expect of the UN in a time of crisis like this. And I'll give you 3 examples. The first is early in the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You might recall that there was this awful moment in which Russian soldiers and the Russian invaders had kind of backed a number of Ukrainian fighters and Ukrainian civilians into this sprawling steel plant outside in the area of Mariupol in southern Ukraine. This was shaping up to be a mass atrocity event in which these civilians were about to be overrun by Russian forces and subjected to all sorts of terrible things, potentially even crimes like we saw happen in Bucha and in other places. So the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, got directly involved and negotiated with Moscow for a humanitarian corridor to get these trapped civilians out of this besieged steel plant. And, he worked with the Red Cross, and eventually there was the civilian convoy that was leaving this besieged area. Now, it was hoped that this very limited diplomatic intervention around a very discrete humanitarian issue would lead to something further. And, in fact, it did. And that was the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This was something that was personally negotiated by the Secretary General. He flew to Moscow, he flew to Kyiv, he negotiated with the key players around this proposal to get Ukrainian wheat and Ukrainian food out of Ukraine and into the rest of the world. And I assume many people on the call are broadly aware of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, but basically, Guterres worked the phones and physically went to Moscow, physically went to Kyiv, went to Turkey to meet with Erdogan, who is also central to this. And the Black Sea Grain Initiative has now been able to unleash food to the rest of the world in the face of global food crisis. The third, and what I think is probably most important for those of us, at least in the West, are efforts by the International Atomic Energy Agency to prevent a tragic nuclear meltdown at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. It's been under Russian occupation since March 2022. And very sort of worryingly, outside electricity to this nuclear power plant has been severed now 7 times. That's concerning because nuclear power plants require constant cooling, and the plant itself is not operational. It's not generating electricity, but it still needs to be connected to the main grid in order for cooling mechanisms to prevent a meltdown like we saw in Chernobyl. And 7 times now, fighting has somehow severed these power lines going into the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So luckily there's some backup emergency diesel generators that worked, but I don't think we as like humanity want like a massive nuclear explosion, nuclear meltdown to be reliant on backup diesel generators. So the IAEA chief, Rafael Grossi, negotiated access to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. There are currently IAEA safety workers there, international workers there that are operating, but more broadly, what he's been trying to do is to prevent the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant from being fought over, because you don't want, cannon fire going into a nuclear power plant. And also you don't want these power lines to be severed any further. So he is in this really intense diplomatic phase right now in which he's working the phones with Guterres and other folks at the UN to try to prevent this catastrophe from happening in Zaporizhzhia. So those are our 3 examples. Beyond that, of course, there's the UN humanitarian agencies are rising to the occasion, supporting people displaced in other countries as well, like the UN Refugee Agency. But that's the answer I give when asked, what good is the UN if it couldn't stop Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
That's excellent. That's so insightful. I got to ask, and then I want to get back to some of the questions from guests, but you have such an incredible understanding of all of the different agencies. Not that it's sort of like having kids, even though we don't have our favorites, we kind of have our favorites, right? Do you have a favorite agency that you like to cover?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So this is like, I would say the World Food Program. Their previous executive director, David Beasley, is someone I interviewed several times. And he was just like a good interview. He was a talker. I haven't yet interviewed Cindy McCain, the new executive director of the World Food Program. But in general, I find WFP to be just like innovative and interesting. Not saying the other ones aren't, but from so when there's a humanitarian emergency, each kind of UN agency has their own area of expertise. The World Food Program obviously does food, but they also do logistics. They're just like have this very sophisticated global logistics system. So they're just able to get one thing from one part of the world to somewhere far flung, like pretty efficiently and effectively. And I find that pretty interesting to cover.
Yeah, I just got back from Madagascar, and it was the first time in a long time I'd really seen the World Food Program in action, in a profound humanitarian crisis, and it really was quite striking that it's not just food. They're running water desaliniants and teaching skills and training to breed a new chicken in one location that we went to. And so it was just really fascinating to see all of the different parts of WFP in particular. So let's go to another question. What role are you playing in, and I'm sorry, this is from Ola. What role are you playing in addressing disinformation in public health, particularly around vaccines?
So what I try to do is explain the value of vaccines. So very recently, I published an episode in which I interviewed the head of UNICEF's childhood vaccination programs. And we had a really, I think, interesting conversation about how COVID really interrupted routine childhood vaccinations in the developing world. If you were to look at like a chart, global coverage of the routine childhood vaccinations to prevent things like diphtheria, polio, all that, it was like a steady, not as fast, I think, as we would like, but it was steady. And then COVID hit and it slumped and it declined. And now you're seeing a group of entities like the Gates Foundation and other public-private partnership trying to reinvigorate access and progress towards global vaccination coverage of just for children in the developing world. And part of the challenge is certainly misinformation. Now, when my audience, I assume, is that listens to the show is on board with the facts that vaccines are safe and effective and widely available and aren't some sort of conspiracy. So I don't see my role as convincing anti-vaxxers that their views are incorrect. Rather, I see what I do as explaining to those of us in the reality-based world why we ought to be paying attention to certain parts of the vaccine story. It's like climate change. I don't argue that climate change is real on the show because I take it as a given that those who listen to the show and are part of this community already kind of believe that or know that to be true. So rather, I focus on what I think are more interesting and important parts of, say, climate solution stories.
Mm. That's great. Well, you mentioned UNICEF, so I feel like we're running through all of the agencies.
Oh, yeah.
And the next question that we have is regarding UNICEF. So Quanta asks, what can UNA USA UNICEF do to be actively engaged in preventing child slave labor, benefiting global corporations in Congo and elsewhere, in addition to efforts for vaccines?
So I don't think I have a good answer to that, right? I'm not I am a journalist, not an advocacy specialist. So in terms of specifically what can your chapter of UNA USA do to help reduce, say, child labor is not a question I think I would be well equipped to answer. I would only recommend that you find reliable sources of information to learn about various parts of the value chain and how your activism or advocacy can be most impactful.
That's great. And what I love about, as I've been going through some of the chat, that there's a lot of young people on the call. So a lot of questions about how to advocate most effectively. This question comes from Mina, and apologies to all of you if I've mispronounced your name. Also a 12-year-old, born in Michigan from parents of Pakistani origin. They say, I've been actively working to do my bit in achieving the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, by successfully launching my small business of sustainable and eco-friendly products for kids. My question for Mark, first of all, that's amazing. Following the Russian-Ukraine crisis, what are your thoughts on the Kashmir issue? And why doesn't the UN intervene to solve the issue, as I feel peacekeeping comes first?
Mm-hmm. Good question on Kashmir. So this is one of those kind of frozen conflicts that kind of plague the UN system. There are a number of them as well. Cyprus is another one. The UN peacekeeping mission in the Sinai is another. What I would say about these kind of peacekeeping missions and these conflicts that appear frozen, that like there has been no underlying sort of peace, positive peace upon which to build, but there has been an absence of what we would call negative peace, of fighting. And that's, I think, a consequence of the UN interventions and UN peacekeeping. Now, often, it's the case that these issues sort of languish from lack of high-level political attention from the Security Council, from Washington, and that is true in a case, say, like Cyprus, or to a lesser extent, I'd say Kashmir. Yet at the same time, you have not seen open warfare in decades upon decades, for the fact that there are UN peacekeepers on the ground. So it's not like the best solution, but it's certainly not a bad solution to invest in peacekeeping and have them prevent conflict from breaking out, even if the conditions are not yet there for broad peace to take root, if that makes sense.
That's excellent. There are so many of those frozen conflicts, but also these young people who are actively engaged as well.
Can I just say something about the young people? So when I started covering these issues 20 years ago, I remember being on one of these UNA USA panels or calls, and the number of people whose name was Gertrude, which is a very old person name, was kind of astounding. And here we are, 2 decades later, and the average age has come down so tremendously. And that gives me real hope for the future of this global movement.
Oh, I completely agree. In fact, I think it's 60% of the UNA USA membership is under the age of 24. And we also have someone who just shared that they were 77 years young. So we are guided as well, standing on the shoulders of giants who've been at this work for decades. We have a new person, and I can't actually see their full name, but calling in from Orange County. Recently joined the UNA USA OC chapter, and wants to get involved in water management and poverty. What kind of resources, places should they go to learn more about what the UN is doing in areas of water and poverty?
So on water issues, again, in humanitarian emergencies, like I said before, each agency kind of has their own area of expertise. And when there's a humanitarian emergency, UNICEF is put in charge of water and sanitation, like building the latrines and ensuring fresh water is coming into populations that need it. So I'd look in the UN system towards UNICEF on water issues, particularly if you're thinking more like water in the sense of preventing drought and understanding the relationship between sort of climate and drought, then I would certainly suggest more broadly UN environment, the UN Environment Program. But more approximately, I'd also recommend that you focus and take a look at what's happening in the Horn of Africa right now. Since October 2020, the Horn of Africa has been in its worst drought in decades upon decades. And it is getting worse and worse. And this is affecting people across 3 countries, primarily Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya. And just 2 weeks ago, the UN humanitarian agencies sought to raise $7 billion to support the basic humanitarian needs of about 40 billion people across these 3 countries who are impacted by this drought. Now, to put that in context, 7 billion is a massive sum for one of these humanitarian appeals. So, when I started covering the UN in 2005, the total amount requested across all crises everywhere was 6 billion. And here the UN is saying they need $7 billion for just one drought crisis in the Horn of Africa. And that is just an astounding number. And unfortunately, they only raised about a third of that thus far. Mm. And you're seeing you're seeing impact from this ongoing emergency pretty much everywhere. I got an email from someone at Doctors Without Borders the other day who has operations in the Dadaab refugee camp, which is the largest refugee camp in the world in that region. It's in Kenya, but it's mostly Somali refugees who have fled there, saying that they don't have the capacity to respond to the growing number of people that are entering this camp seeking refuge, and they're there because of this ongoing drought that threatens to tip the region into famine. So that's just like a story, a global story that's not getting the attention I think it deserves, but one I think that folks on this call ought to be sort of pressing their flesh on.
Mm-hmm. And that was Sandeep who had asked that question from Orange County. I love this question coming from Rosalba. How is or where is the UN investing in teaching conflict resolution skills?
Ooh, that's a good question. So interestingly, about 3-4 years ago, in the last few years, there was this big kind of bureaucratic restructuring of how the UN does peacekeeping and peace building. There used to be what's called the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, kind of used to do it all, and there was this Department of Peace Building that kind of did its own thing, and they kind of merged the two recently to focus more on conflict prevention. This has been like one of Guterres's kind of big focuses early on, was how do we, it's very expensive and very politically difficult to respond to conflicts and deploy peacekeepers once conflict has broken out. Let us rather invest more and more deeply in efforts to prevent conflict from breaking out in the first place, and to do sort of peace building exercises when needed. Now, a lot of this work around like very local peace building is supported by the UN, but implemented by local NGOs that like we've never heard of, because they are just, NGOs from Mali who are of the community in Mali doing like conflict prevention work. How do you, for example, make it so that like this one water source between these two villages doesn't become a source of conflict between the two villages? Or how do you support young men who are teenagers in the village from becoming prey to violent extremist groups or joining ISIS? Like what, and this is like expertise that like the international community can't have necessarily because they're not like of the community, but rather they can do what's necessary and important to support those very hyper local efforts, which are the most impactful efforts. And I've done an episode on this very topic recently on the podcast. I think it was in December 2022, about like local peace building work. I think it was in Niger is where this effort was underway.
You bring up such a good point around kind of the public-private partnerships and how local communities are involved and engaged, and knowing that there are so many young people on this call. I'd also urge you for folks who are interested in doing learning more about the conflict resolution work. The State Department also has partnered around the world doing through Educational Cultural Affairs. So this is always inspiring, where the UN kind of meets the US, meets some of our global partners, shows up, and then also shores up local agencies that are there doing the work. So we have time for just maybe one or two more questions. So I'm going to have to kind of run through this relatively quickly. But before we get to the last couple of questions, I have to ask, because you've mentioned global drought and famine and war and all of the heavy topics that keep us up at night. How do you, as you're kind of navigating those stories of human suffering, how do you take care of yourself?
So I get this question asked actually fairly often as well. And I honestly don't think that there's like a deep psychological answer I can give you about how I compartmentalize Rather, I think the answer lies in the kind of journalism that I do. When I cover these stories, I don't like dwell on the problem, right? Like there is this problem of drought and potential famine in the Horn of Africa, and that is a problem that ought to be more widely recognized. But rather than focus exclusively on the problem, each episode I integrate and weave into conversations about what the solution to that problem is. So I use like a solutions frame to approach these great global problems in ways that I think leave me, at least, and leave listeners hopeful and understanding that these are not intractable or insoluble problems. Rather, there are solutions to these problems, and it just takes a modicum of potential political will or money or whatever that solution is to get there. And so I see my role as trying to surface some of these solutions to these great global problems in ways that are empowering to the audience and, helpful to the world, I would suppose. So I don't see it in a way. I don't. The frame isn't exclusively negative. There's always like There's always a solution to the kind of problems that I'm covering.
That's insightful, and I think for listeners or folks who are joining today, especially those who are doing the advocacy on the ground and kind of steeped in what can seem like an overwhelming deluge of negative news, that there's a way to frame that to make sure that they're not burning out and can continue to advocate. So just a couple more questions, and then we will let you go. And you might, apologies again, you might have heard a little bit of distraction in the background here. We are, of course, having this interview from Washington, D.C. for the Leadership Summit. So it's been exciting. And now we are wrapping up a very full day to get started tomorrow. So I hope everyone on the call is also going to be participating in call-in day. To contact your members of Congress and let them know that how valuable the support is for the UN. And to that point, there was a question from a member of the audience. I live in a deep red state, and I am consistently asked why I support the UN. Could you reflect on U.S. support for the UN? Why is it so important? And why isn't the NGO and State Department world enough?
Mm-hmm. So the UN was created in the wake of World War II to prevent the return of great global conflict. The people who wrote the UN Charter, the preamble, as you guys probably know, the UN Charter says, twice in our lives, the world has seen this horrible destruction caused by the outbreak of World War. And I would say, number one, since the founding of the United Nations, there has not been another world war. And that's a significant achievement considering where the world was in the generation prior. So it is a consequence of the advent of the UN that there are fewer wars today, and there have been 0 world wars since the advent of the United Nations. So just based on that, against that very sort of basic metric, the UN is doing all right. We survived the Cold War. We may be entering into a new perilous phase with China. We'll see how the UN system can withstand sort of changing global power structures. But there's that very basic answer. There's also this idea. There's kind of 2 UNs, I like to say. There's the UN that talks, and then there's the UN that acts. And the UN that talks should not be dismissed. These talks have led to really important global treaties. There's no hole in our ozone anymore because of a treaty negotiated through the United Nations. Peacekeepers are able to deploy to global hotspots to prevent conflicts from metastasizing and affecting our own security here in the United States because of the work of the Security Council. So while it can seem at times that the Security Council is unable to stop a specific conflict, say like Russia invading of Ukraine, there are still a number of things that it is doing to prevent crises from getting worse. So that's like the UN that talks, and there's the UN that acts. These are like the first responders around the world. When there's an earthquake somewhere, when a man-made or natural disaster, the first, not the first people on the scene, but people who often are able to respond most effectively to take that place of crisis to a place of hope is a constellation of UN agencies like the World Food Program, like UNICEF, like the UN Refugee Agency, who over years have gotten like very good at responding to disasters and efficiently responding to disasters to save people from suffering. And so they're like any constellation of issues you can imagine that are happening in the world. The UN is impacting in some way that's meaningful. We live in a world in which there are a number of global problems that require global solutions. The UN is imperfect, but a useful platform to come together around some of these solutions to these great global problems.
That's really powerful. This has been great. Before we let you go, how about plugging all of your platforms for our listeners today? Where can folks find you?
Yeah, I would say the number one thing that you could do is just sign up for my email list. You can do so on undispatch.com. There's like a little pop-up box that'll pop up there, and you can just type your email. It's all free. You'll get updates from me with new episodes as well. Sorry. Yeah. So I can, in the chat box, I can put UN Dispatch in. Would also recommend that if you listen to podcasts, you can subscribe directly on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or wherever it is that you listen to podcasts of the show. And it's Global Dispatches, World News That Matter. So I would recommend those two things.
We will make sure that they are also on Twitter, and we've promoted all the ways to get connected with you and your work. Thank you for all you're doing for the UN. Thank you to everyone who's joined today and all you're doing for the UN and for UNA USA. And we look forward to hearing great things about Call-in Day or Hill Day, wherever you're planning on participating and advocating for full funding for the UN. Thank you.
Thank you. And sorry for the dog eruption at the very end here.
There's always a dog.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.